December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. SS Obersturmführer Werner Krause pressed his frozen hands against the receiver of his MG-42 machine gun, feeling the metal's bitter cold seep into his bones. Around him, the opening salvos of Hitler's last great gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, roared through the snow-covered pines. His weapon should have been purring death at 1,200 rounds per minute. Instead, it had jammed. Again. Krause wrenched open the feed tray, his breath forming white clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The barrel, supposedly brand new, issued just 3 weeks ago, showed hairline fractures along its length. Metal fatigue. Impossible in a weapon with barely 2,000 rounds through it. But there it was. What Werner Krause didn't know, what none of the 200,000 German troops flooding through the Ardennes that morning knew, was that his weapon's failure was a symptom of something far more catastrophic than a manufacturing defect. Deep in the industrial heartland of the dying Third Reich, German metallurgists were facing an impossible equation. How do you harden steel when you've run out of the one substance that makes it possible? The answer they found would be so desperate, so bizarre, that it sounds like fiction. This is the story of how Nazi Germany's war machine, starved of critical resources, turned to one of the most unconventional solutions in military history, and how a shortage of Romanian oil led to German gun barrels being quenched in rendered animal fat. To understand how Germany arrived at this desperate measure, we need to rewind 18 months to June 1943. Picture the Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach armaments works in Essen, the dark, beating heart of German war production. Stretching across 600 acres, employing over 100,000 workers, this sprawling complex produced everything from battleship armor to tank cannons. In Building 14, the heat treatment facility, Oberingenieur Friedrich Mauser faced a problem that would have seemed unthinkable just 2 years earlier. His team had just completed a production run of 88mm anti-aircraft gun barrels, the legendary Act 8, that served double duty destroying Allied bombers and Soviet tanks. But when the barrels emerged from the quenching tanks, Mauser knew immediately something was wrong. The steel felt different, softer. When his quality control team ran hardness tests, the Rockwell readings came back dangerously low. These barrels would fail after perhaps 300 rounds, instead of the expected 3,000. In combat, that difference meant life or death. The culprit, the quenching oil. Now, if you're not familiar with metallurgy, let me explain what should be a simple process, but is actually one of the most critical steps in making any weapon. When you forge a gun barrel, you're working with steel heated to around 850 to 900 degrees Celsius. That's over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to glow bright orange. At this temperature, the molecular structure of the steel becomes malleable, allowing it to be shaped. But here's where the magic happens. To give that steel the hardness it needs to withstand thousands of explosions, you need to cool it rapidly in a process called quenching. Think of it like freezing the metal's molecular structure in a specific configuration. Too slow, and the steel remains soft. Too fast, and it becomes brittle and shatters. For decades, the perfect medium for this process had been specialized quenching oils, thick, carefully formulated mineral oils that cooled the steel at exactly the right rate. The German arms industry consumed approximately 12,000 tons of these specialized oils annually during peacetime production. But by mid-1943, those oils were disappearing. On August 1, 1943, American B-24 Liberators launched Operation Tidal Wave, a massive low-altitude bombing raid against the Ploiesti oil fields in Romania. 178 bombers attacked the refineries that provided Nazi Germany with roughly 30% of its total crude oil supply and an even larger percentage of the specialized petroleum products used in industry. The raid was catastrophic for the Americans. 54 aircraft lost, 660 airmen killed or captured, making it one of the costliest missions of the war. But it was also catastrophic for Germany. Fuel production at Ploiesti dropped by 46% in the immediate aftermath. and it would never fully recover. But crude oil for gasoline was only part of the problem. The real crisis came in the specialized derivatives: quenching oil, lubricating oil, hydraulic fluid, all the exotic petroleum products that kept a modern industrial war machine functioning. These weren't things you could easily substitute or synthesize. By January 1944, German armaments ministry reports showed that supplies of industrial quenching oil had fallen to just 18% of 1942 levels. The few remaining stocks were being rationed ruthlessly, allocated only to the most critical projects: jet engine components, U-boat pressure hulls, and the armor plate for the new King Tiger tanks. Standard infantry weapons, machine guns, artillery barrels, they were now classified as secondary priority. Which brings us back to Friedrich Maurer, standing in his factory in Essen, staring at barrels that couldn't be hardened properly because his quenching tanks were running dry. The Nazi armaments minister, Albert Speer, held an emergency conference on February 12, 1944, bringing together Germany's top metallurgists, chemists, and industrial engineers. The question on the table was brutally simple. What could replace petroleum-based quenching oil? The suggestions that followed revealed just how desperate the situation had become. Water was the first obvious substitute. After all, blacksmiths had been quenching hot metal in water for thousands of years. But water cools too quickly for the high-carbon steels used in gun barrels. Test after test showed the same result. The steel became so brittle that barrels would crack during firing, sometimes catastrophically. One trial firing of a water-quenched MG-42 barrel resulted in the weapon literally exploding, killing the testing technician. Synthetic oils derived from coal. Germany's Fischer-Tropsch plants were already running at maximum capacity, producing synthetic gasoline for the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. There was no spare capacity, and the chemistry required to create proper quenching oil was completely different from making fuel. Vegetable oils. In a nation where the civilian population was already on starvation rations, diverting food-grade oils to industry was politically impossible. Besides, the available quantities were laughable, maybe 2,000 tons annually, when the armaments industry needed 10 times that much. Then someone proposed something that sounded absolutely insane: animal fats. Dr. Heinrich Schwarz, a metallurgist from the Solingen cutlery district, had done experiments before the war using rendered beef tallow to harden knife blades. The process worked after a fashion, though no one had ever considered it for industrial-scale weapons production. Tallow, rendered animal fat, had a cooling rate somewhere between water and mineral oil. It wasn't ideal, but it might work. More importantly, it was available. Consider the grim arithmetic of total war. The Eastern Front was consuming hundreds of thousands of horses monthly, draft animals, cavalry mounts, captured livestock. The Wehrmacht slaughterhouses were processing an estimated 50,000 horses per month by early 1944, plus cattle, pigs, and sheep from occupied territories and dwindling domestic herds. All of that produced rendered fat as a byproduct, fat that was currently being used for soap, candles, and margarine. But fat that could, theoretically, be redirected. On March 8, 1944, Speer authorized trial production runs using animal fats as quenching medium. If you're wondering what that looked like in practice, let me paint you a picture. The Mauser factory in Oberndorf am Neckar, April 1944. Workers wheeled in 50-gallon drums marked not with industrial chemical codes, but with labels from Wehrmacht slaughterhouses. The smell hit you first, a thick, meaty odor that permeated everything. Inside the drums, rendered tallow, still slightly warm from processing, with the consistency of soft butter. The metallurgists had to heat the tallow to liquefy it, maintaining it at around 60 to 70 degrees Celsius in the quenching tanks. Picture that for a moment. Massive steel vats filled with what was essentially liquefied animal fat, looking like enormous pots of gravy, bubbling slightly, the smell indescribable. When the first test barrel, glowing orange hot at 900 degrees, was plunged into the tallow bath, the reaction was dramatic. The fat boiled violently, sending up clouds of greasy steam that coated every surface in the building. Workers had to wear full face protection because the vapor left an oily film on skin and in lungs. But when they tested the barrel's hardness 2 hours later, the readings were acceptable. Not ideal, not as good as proper quenching oil, but good enough that the barrel would probably survive 800 to 1,000 rounds before failing. In the desperate arithmetic of 1944, Germany, that was enough. By May 1944, the practice had spread to armaments factories across the Reich. Steyr in Austria, Gustloff-Werke in Suhl, Erma in Erfurt, all began receiving shipments of rendered animal fats alongside their steel stock. The German Armaments Ministry issued Directive No. 4, 1447/44, on June 3rd, officially authorizing the use of organic, fat-based cooling media for heat treatment of small arms components. In bureaucratic language, they just admitted that the Third Reich was hardening its weapons in rendered animal fat. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I hope you are, leave a comment below letting me know what you think about this desperate improvisation. Were the Germans brilliant engineers making do with what they had, or was this a sign of how thoroughly their industrial capacity had collapsed? Now you might be wondering, did it actually work? And what did this mean for the soldiers carrying these weapons? Let's jump forward to September 1944, the Hürtgen forest on the German-Belgian border. This would become one of the longest and bloodiest battles fought by the US Army in World War II, a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions in the dense, dark woods. Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann, a machine gunner with the 275th Infantry Division, was learning the hard way about the limitations of fat-quenched barrels. His MG-42 had been firing in short bursts for most of the morning, providing covering fire as his unit withdrew through the forest. Nothing excessive, maybe 300 rounds total, well within normal operational parameters. Then, during a particularly intense exchange with advancing American troops, his barrel cracked. Not catastrophically like the water-quenched prototypes, but enough that the weapon's accuracy degraded to uselessness. The barrel had warped slightly and rounds began keyholing, tumbling in flight instead of spinning true. Hoffmann's experience was becoming increasingly common. German small arms were failing at rates that would have been unthinkable in 1941 or 1942. Statistically, weapons produced after mid-1944 had failure rates approximately 3 to 4 times higher than earlier production runs. But here's the thing, Germany, in late 1944, didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfect solutions. The Red Army was steamrolling through Poland. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition it couldn't win. In that context, gun barrels that lasted for 800 rounds instead of 3,000 were still infinitely better than no gun barrels at all. The armaments production numbers tell a story of desperate industriousness. Despite the Allied bombing campaign, despite the loss of occupied territories and their resources, despite shortages of everything from specialized steels to skilled workers, German factories actually increased small arms production in 1944. The Wehrmacht took delivery of approximately 1.2 million K98K rifles in 1944, compared to 900,000 in 1943. MG-42 production reached over 400,000 units. MP-40 submachine guns, STG-44 assault rifles, all saw production increases even as the Reich crumbled. How? By accepting lower quality, by using slave labor on a massive scale, by simplifying designs, eliminating unnecessary parts, substituting materials wherever possible, and by quenching gun barrels in animal fat. The fat quenching process created its own bizarre logistical challenges. Rendered tallow had to be transported from slaughterhouses to factories in those 50-gallon drums we mentioned. But tallow solidifies at room temperature. During the winter of 1944 to 45, the coldest in decades, shipments would arrive as solid blocks of fat that had to be slowly melted before use. There were quality control problems too. Not all animal fat is created equal. Beef tallow worked reasonably well. Pork lard was less effective. Horse fat, increasingly common, as the Wehrmacht consumed its remaining cavalry and transport animals, produced inconsistent results. Some factories began blending different fats, searching for optimal mixtures. Others added small amounts of whatever petroleum oil they could scrounge to improve the quenching properties. The whole process became as much art as science, with individual factories developing their own proprietary recipes. One report from the Steel-Hardening facility in Suhl noted that their metallurgists had developed a blend of 70% beef tallow, 25% horse fat, and 5% salvaged industrial oil that produced acceptable results for K98 K rifle barrels. They'd arrived at this through trial and error, testing dozens of combinations. Imagine being a German engineer in 1944 with a doctorate in metallurgical science, running experiments to determine the optimal mixture of rendered animal fats for hardening rifle barrels. It's almost Pythonesque in its absurdity, except it was deadly serious, because by autumn 1944 the fat supply itself was becoming problematic. The Eastern Front's collapse meant losing access to the vast agricultural resources of Ukraine and Poland. Domestic German livestock herds were being slaughtered faster than they could reproduce. Even horses were becoming scarce as the Wehrmacht's logistics network broke down and motorization increased out of necessity. Some factories began using fats that were clearly not suitable. There are documented cases of weapons being quenched in rancid fat, in whale oil diverted from the last few whaling ships, even in the greases rendered from concentration camp victims, a grotesque horror that adds another layer of evil to the Nazi regime's crimes. The desperation reached its peak during the Battle of the Bulge, which brings us full circle to where we started. Remember SS Obersturmführer Werner Krause in the Ardennes, his MG-42 failing in the opening hours of the offensive? His weapons barrel had been manufactured in October 1944 at the Mauser factory in Berlin-Borsigwalde. Records show that factory had been using a tallow-based quenching medium since July. The barrel had cracked because the heat treatment hadn't fully hardened the steel. Under rapid-fire conditions, the relatively soft metal had expanded unevenly, creating stress fractures. This was a known problem with fat-quenched barrels, but there was simply no alternative. Across the Ardennes battlefield that frozen December, German weapons were failing at alarming rates, not just machine guns, but artillery barrels too. The 105mm howitzers that were supposed to provide crucial fire support were experiencing premature wear. Some guns that should have been good for 10,000 rounds were wearing out after 2,000. American intelligence officers, when they captured intact German weapons, began noticing the quality degradation. One report from January 1945 noted, "Enemy small arms show marked decline in manufacturing quality. Barrels exhibit unusual wear patterns and metallurgical inconsistencies, suggesting improper heat treatment." They had no idea about the animal fat, of course. That particular detail wouldn't fully emerge until post-war interrogations of German industrialists and engineers. The offensive in the Ardennes failed for many reasons: fuel shortages, Allied air superiority once the weather cleared, the stubborn defense at Bastogne, German logistics breaking down. But the gradual degradation of weapons reliability played its part too, small failures compounding into larger ones, all stemming from decisions made in armaments factories months earlier. By March 1945, even the animal fat was running out. German factories were using whatever they could find. Some barrels were quenched in a mixture that included rendered fat from soap production, salvaged cooking oils, even petroleum substitutes derived from coal tar that had been rejected for every other purpose. The quality of weapons coming out of German factories in the war's final months was abysmal by any standard. Barrels that might last 500 rounds before failing, actions that jammed frequently, safety mechanisms that didn't work properly, but still they produced them. Still the factories ran even as Allied armies approached from both east and west. The Gustloff-Werke in Suhl continued producing K98 K rifles until April 3, 1945, just days before American troops occupied the town. The Mauser factory in Oberndorf operated until French forces arrived on April 20th. And through those final months, gun barrels were still being quenched in animal fat because there was literally nothing else available. When the war ended and Allied technical intelligence teams began examining German industrial facilities, the discovery of animal fat quenching created considerable interest. Not because it was a good idea, everyone agreed it was a desperate improvisation, but because it represented something larger. It showed how a modern industrial economy, when pushed to absolute limits, will try absolutely anything to keep functioning. The Germans had faced an impossible situation. They needed to harden steel, they had no proper quenching oil, and stopping weapons production wasn't an option, so they used rendered animal fat. Was it effective? Barely. The weapons produced were inferior in almost every measurable way to earlier production runs. Failure rates were higher, lifespans were shorter, reliability was compromised. But, and this is crucial, it was better than nothing. A rifle that might fail after 1,000 rounds was still a functional weapon for the short-term desperate fighting of 1944 to 45. In the apocalyptic battles of that final year, when German units often didn't survive more than a few weeks at the front, weapon longevity became less important than simply having weapons available. The post-war metallurgical studies of German weapons quenched in animal fats became teaching examples in materials science courses, not as examples of good practice, but as case studies in what happens when industrial processes break down and engineers are forced to improvise. Some of those fat-quenched weapons still exist today in museums and private collections. If you know what to look for, and if chemical analysis is performed, you can still detect traces of the organic compounds used in their heat treatment. Literally, there are World War II German rifles in museums that have molecules of animal fat embedded in their steel. The broader lesson here goes beyond metallurgy or even military history. It's about the nature of total war and industrial collapse. Nazi Germany in 1944 to 45 was experiencing what we might call cascading systems failure. The loss of Romanian oil didn't just mean less gasoline for tanks and planes, it meant losing the raw materials for thousands of industrial processes. Quenching oil was just one relatively minor example, but it rippled through the entire weapons production system. And because this was total war, because the Nazi regime was fighting for its survival and was willing to commit any atrocity and accept any sacrifice, they kept the machine running through sheer desperation. Slave labor, ersatz materials, technical improvisation, and yes, quenching gun barrels in rendered animal fat. The results were predictable, weapons that didn't work as well. Soldiers like Werner Krauss in the Ardennes dying because their equipment failed at critical moments. An industrial base that was producing more weapons than ever before but of steadily declining quality. It's a reminder that quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin supposedly said, but quantity without quality eventually collapses under its own weight. Today, the use of animal fats for quenching steel is occasionally employed in artisanal knife-making and traditional blacksmithing. Some bladesmiths claim that tallow quenching produces certain desirable properties in high-carbon steel blades. There's debate about whether this is actually true or just traditional practice perpetuating. But in modern industrial metallurgy, animal fat quenching is a historical curiosity, nothing more. Modern quenching oils, polymer solutions, and controlled atmosphere processes produce far superior results with perfect consistency. The German experiment with fat-quenched weapons stands as a unique historical footnote, a bizarre, desperate solution to an impossible problem born from the collapse of a monstrous regime that had overextended itself beyond any possibility of success. When you see a German K98 key rifle or MG42 machine gun in a museum, there's a real possibility you're looking at a weapon whose barrel was hardened in rendered animal fat during those desperate final months of the Third Reich. A weapon that represents not German engineering prowess but German industrial desperation. A weapon that failed Werner Krauss in the frozen Ardennes forest and thousands of other soldiers across the collapsing fronts of 1945. The steel might still be hard enough to ring when you tap it, but if you could somehow analyze its molecular structure, you'd find the ghost of that desperate compromise. Organic compounds, where petroleum derivatives should be, a permanent record of the day Nazi Germany's war machine ran out of oil and turned to whatever it could find. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, make sure you're subscribed, because we're going to keep diving into these little-known technical and industrial stories from World War II. The devil is in the details, and sometimes those details involve quenching gun barrels in animal fat,